so much. Folks, thank you for taking a longer break than I had intended. I had a technical difficulty. It looks like most folks enjoyed themselves on the break. Anyway.
We are happy to accommodate.
Yeah, I'm glad. Luckily it happened during a time that made sense for break. Also during that kerfuffle, I seem to have misplaced my slide advance.
I got it.
You, oh, because are you rocking? And, ladies and gentlemen, Maria Matarella.
Question for you. Why is a theme in Agile making things visible?
It makes it so they get addressed.
So things get addressed? So why is it a thing in Agile to make stuff visible? So we can address stuff? What else?
Because it's faster to absorb and to interact with other people if you have like a visual reference to.
Okay, so we can interact faster, we can absorb things better.
Sometimes when you make things visible and people draw their own conclusions, they are much more willing to accept those conclusions and act on them, and if you tell them straight away.
Okay, so we get team buy-in because we have people that are bringing something to the table and participating.
Provides credibility.
Credibility?
Similar to.
Yeah. I mean, really, when we look at the Toyota Way, and principle number 7 is all about visual control, and that helps improve flow. So as soon as you can look anywhere, like right now, everyone here can see exactly what we have left to cover, what we're working on now, what's in the current sprint, and we can see the rate that we're doing things. So this just helps the whole team stay up to speed better, and also helps us to make sure that people can see how good of a job we're doing, right? So the team can see, oh look, we're this close to finishing the sprint, and then it's in the intent is so that we can get all the team members on board without the central point of control, right? So the Scrum board is not a core artifact in Scrum, which is interesting, but a lot of teams will use it. They'll use the task board because it's so helpful for everyone to see exactly what the team's working on at that point in time. Has anyone ever seen a board this intense? Yeah. This was where Delta was looking at merging 2 airlines. And they looked at how can we visualize everything so that we can see, how do we merge the online systems, at least get them talking first, and then start to integrate. But also, merging the brands, and the color coding actually serves a purpose. If you look on the right, you have the keys, so airports and gates, alliance partners, those are green, loyalty programs blue, airport operations pink, aircraft control purple. So at a glance, visually, you can see what types of activities are being done, and this is a multi-year timeline here. I've seen a board like this. In fact, we created one. I was doing Agile coaching in Chicago for a couple of years. Navtech does all the GPS routing and location-based services. They were acquired by Nokia, who was then acquired by Microsoft. So they've had several iterations over the last several years. But we actually created a release planning board so that the program managers could see across multiple teams what team was doing what. And we had that same cadence, so every 2 weeks, the teams would be on 2-week cadence of sprints, and then we could coordinate the releases. So we could visually see in the swim lanes what's one team working on, and then is there dependency with another team, and that helped us to just at a glance, because this was in the hallway. We just put this in the hallway so people walking by could see at a big picture level what was being done by what team when. So anytime you can make things visual, any manager could walk in and see where you're at, right? So that's really a big theme in Agile, and we call these information radiators because they're radiating information. This is an example of a typical task board, just the to-do, doing, and done. I personally like to add another column in here called roadblock. Has anyone else ever done a roadblock column? Are there any other columns that you guys would add to your task board?
Verify.
Verify? Yeah, I really like that one too, where the team puts things into the verify column and then the product owner moves it to done.
We've done it for code review or for testing.
Code review, awesome. So making sure, if you want to make sure you do the code reviews and everything's tested, maybe even split it. I've seen some teams actually break the doing column into develop and test. So as soon as it's done developing, it's in the testing column. Tester knows I can work on that. Yeah.
Sign off.
Sign off. Yeah, anything that you want to make visual, you can do. Now, you might have an instance where you don't have the column, but if something's blocked, you just put the Post-it note up on that item, and you say, okay, look, that's blocked. Anytime you see this, immediately we need the Scrum Master to look at it.
Unanticipated bullshit is the column I've seen.
I like it. Okay.
It's a UBS, and I had to ask what it meant, and as soon as they answered, It was self-evident.
UBS, ladies and gentlemen, you heard it here. I like that. Something similar I did once is we had a team that they kept getting blocked and we couldn't. Well, what happened was about 50% of the sprint was churn. New work added up to 50%. I mean, that's pretty ridiculous, right? That's a lot of change. In fact, this was the last team out of 70 teams that had transitioned to using Agile. So we said, okay, they're like, I think what happened was the manager, he was like the only team that wasn't Agile, and he heard all the other managers talking about this Agile thing and how great it was. He's like, well, we want to be Agile too, right? And so he sort of put in a request for his team to get trained. And it was actually a tech writing team, so they weren't really doing any development per se. But we said, okay, yeah, sure, we'll train you. And then I was their Agile coach, and they had 50% of new work added in the sprint. And I'm like, what's going on here? Guess who the biggest violator of that was, adding work to the sprint? The manager, yeah. The manager that wanted to go Agile. He wasn't following the approach. And so what I did is I took a piece of paper, and at the top I labeled it inflicted work. And then we did the little slash mark thing every time it happened. And about, I think it was 2 or 3 days later, I walked up to the team room, and I was like, oh, where'd the inflicted work sheet go? It was gone. And I was like, oh, did the manager see it? Did he get mad? Am I gonna get fired? Like, you know, I was like, what happened here is it's not there. And the Scrum Master was like, no, it worked. It's like, what? She's like, no, it worked. The manager was like, what's this? I'm like, oh, that's anytime work is inflicted in our sprint. And simply by making that visible, he stopped inflicting work, at least for a week or two. I mean, we had to, you know, it was an ongoing thing, one step at a time. But, I mean, imagine that, just making things visible. He didn't want to be the person that was the inflictor of the work. So, what you can see here in this task board, we've got the burn down chart visible, the work is here in the left column, and we've got these larger items that are broken into smaller tasks. There's also a Kaizen row and a buffer row. Now, as you're updating this, the team can now clearly see what's happening, and you know, some teams will take a product backlog item and break it into smaller tasks. Joe has an alternative way to think about tasking here. So, you know, some of the best teams will actually have smaller stories or product backlog items instead of doing that decomposition into tasks. And in fact, estimation is such a controversial approach in the industry. Even the people that started story points, some of them say, we don't really believe that anymore, just break things down to small tasks, break it down to 1s and 2s. So the smaller things are, the less ambiguity, the less uncertainty or surprises that we could have. So it's a very controversial thing on how do we break this down. Now, this isn't really part of core Scrum per se, because Scrum doesn't tell us exactly how to break things down, doesn't tell us how to estimate. It's just that framework with the 3-5-3 that Joe was talking about. But here's an example of a way to break down the work. If you look at tasking as acceptance tests, so the deposit story, which we'd seen on our board there, on the Scrum board, the task could be, you know, written as failed test written, DO access completed, code cleanup, integration testing. So whatever you're trying to track, what I found is that I don't try to prescribe to a team how to break the work down, but let's try something for a sprint, and then let's reflect on, did that work? Was that effective? Was it too much detail? I've had teams where everything was so high level, nothing moved. I've had other teams where, you know, trying to make it less high level, we broke down so small. I had teams abandoning the board out of fear. They're like, I can't look at that thing. It's you know, it's terrifying. And you never want an abandoned board. You want it to reflect reality. So when reflecting, ask those questions in your retrospective. Is this too much detail? Is this not enough detail? Did we break down these tasks properly? And you'll refine from there. Try it at a different level the next time. If you look at this board, once the team starts doing the work, you can put the stuff into the doing column, and the whole goal is to get stuff to the done column. So once these items are done, related to the deposit story or product backlog item, then that item can go into the done column. But has anybody ever had a team that just wasn't really finishing a sprint? They're kind of struggling? What are some warning signs we might see? Looking at this picture, what might be something you might be concerned about?
Stair steps.
Stair steps? Okay, so in our burn down chart, you can see that this is kind of going over, then down, over, and down. Anything else? Yeah.
The sprint backlog is typically in the descending order of value. So now that implies, if so, that implies that they worked on the lowest value item in the sprint, the one that could have been dropped if anything.
Yeah, they're starting at the bottom. Who prioritizes the sprint backlog? The sprint backlog.
Scrum Master.
Team. So there's a brief exam at the end of this course for Certified Scrum Master. A tip for you may want to make a note of. Anything related to the product backlog is the product owner. Anything within the sprint is the team's domain. So the team prioritizes their own work in the sprint, the team estimates the team. Anything related to within the sprint or during the work is actually the team's domain. So yeah, if this is implied priority order, and does anyone read what that item is? The back-end user admin. Does that sound like the highest priority? No. Maybe the migration tool or logging in or something else.
Now, like in Streamline, the way I talk to product owners and teams, I say that when you make that commitment, the order in which you pull the items from the original document is implies the value order also in the sprint. So therefore, that order is inherited from the product backlog. So I don't think that the team has the right to change that order, but they can choose what order they do the items as long as they meet the value order of the original backlog. That's how I see it.
Yeah, Joe, is there any priority to our class backlog here?
Yes, there is.
Okay, so is it better for us to start at the top of this list?
It is.
Okay. If something had to fall off, the stuff at the bottom, that would be the lowest priority?
That is correct.
Yeah.
All right.
So that's what I mean by the implied order from the original backlog would be the same.
Okay.
Inherited to the original backlog.
Yeah, let's look at another example here. What might be a warning or something that doesn't look quite right on this one?
How can you have stuff in doing and done?
Okay, so there's stuff in doing and done. Is anyone else alarmed by that?
There's a lot to do.
Oh yeah, there's a lot to do.
They're not working on any of the features, and they got a lot of stuff in
Ah, they're only working on buffer stuff.
What's buffer stuff? I mean, the red line, it says buffer, it's kind of emergency stuff.
Can anybody read the words on the buffer stuff? What type of stuff is that?
Sales support,
Marketing.
marketing demo, yeah, fix bug, white paper.
Does that seem as important as some of the other items here?
It's a misprioritization.
Who would like to give us a brief summary of what the buffer row is here?
Other people's work.
So we call it a placeholder, but it's for something that we know is going to be there, but we don't necessarily know what it's going to entail, so we don't want to miss it in the sprint, so we create a little space for it.
It's like a parking lot.
Okay, so
Exactly.
unplanned work.
Yeah.
So should we be working on the buffer stuff, the unplanned work first?
Well,
It's
yeah,
a
it
priority.
depends. It's a question.
So
If it's
a
a,
prioritize it.
yeah, if it's very hot.
Only if it's genuinely more valuable than the work in your backlog. And that's not very common case. It shouldn't be common case because if it were, it should be more.
Okay, so only if it's more valuable than the other stuff in your backlog, but that's more the exception than the rule, right?
I'd be suspicious of that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, buffer, just the word buffer doesn't feel like it's a very key prioritized feature, right? So there's a row for it, but support for sales, fixing bugs, a white paper. The customer down one looks like that one was important.
Yep.
The other ones might be questionable.
Just to emphasize that, I would actually put the buffer at the bottom of the list, that it would imply the lowest priority items by default unless accepted.
I like that. Put the buffer at the bottom of the list because it's implying, and visually we can then see that it's a lower priority. Has anybody ever had stretch goals in a sprint? I don't like stretch goals, and why do you think that is?
It forces you to take on more.
Team might take on more than their capacity? What else?
I think if a team is not comfortable with committing and you're coaching them and you see that they're uncomfortable committing, you sense from the first sprint and now you're in the second that they could actually do more but they're just hesitant. I think sometimes that's a way to help, encourage them. And I've seen it with the team I worked with where, they actually got almost everything done within their stretch as well as the stuff they committed to.
Okay, so the reason teams will use stretch goals is because if they're hesitant committing, it's kind of like a little, area of gray where they don't have to feel like
It's no pressure.
Less
It's just,
pressure.
Let's
Okay.
just, maybe we can go
Yeah.
a little further.
I mean, adding to that, there is this, constant pace thing in the Agile Manifesto. So we're permanently trying to go faster, where you might basically run out of, breath. And on the other hand side, instead of squeezing more and more in, I'd like to take opportunity to improve the system. So it's a kind of, not get more and more and more done, but actually look at how good are we at getting better.
Okay, so if we have more encouraged stories, but the team's capacity or historical velocity has only been X, the team might start to work on more stuff rather than look at improving. But what I've seen often is the team will have more than just the original stuff in progress, and they'll actually start to work on the stretch stories before they finish the regular work for the sprint. So what I like to encourage is, let's take this stretch item, put it safely on the top of the product backlog. It's right there. We can access it any time. We all can see it. But there's something cognitively about when it's not in this list and it's over here that it helps the team also feel accomplished about when they do finish everything in the sprint. So I would rather have it be more clear that this is our sprint goal. We have a stretch item, great. Store the stretches on the top of the product backlog, because otherwise you might have team members start to work on it before they finish the other stuff for the sprint.
Yes, it's a psychological trait. I mean, pulling a new item, like you said, from the top of the back, it's a victory. It's a major victory.
Yeah.
But if it's already there in the list and you do it, it's like another thing you were supposed to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very deflating, especially when you don't get to do it.
Yeah, so that's a really good point here on, maybe put the buffer stuff at the bottom, because that's visually telling us that's a lower priority. So anytime you can make a change that can help the team automatically see what they should be doing, that's a win. Now here's a question, what's wrong with this picture?
Nothing getting done. Yeah, too much wood.
Too much work in progress, everything at once.
Nothing getting finished.
Well, look at the burn down chart. What does this show?
Nothing getting done.
Nothing's done. And what's the risk to that?
You don't know your velocity, you don't know
If you're gonna get done, start.
We're not, many things. We don't know if we're gonna get done. If that trend continues, it's kind of a gamble of all or nothing. It's much more ideal, and Joe's spoken to lots of facts and figures about if we can get something completely done, something else completely done without the context switching, that can help us get more things completed. I've had teams where they had so much in progress as far as initiatives from leadership, where they said, hey, these 3 giant epics need to be completed, these 3 initiatives. And the teams were told to work on all 3 at the same time. One of them, at the end of the 5 sprints of our release plan, we had one like 80% done, the other was like 65% done, and the other was 77% done. None of those 3 initiatives were done. But what if they would have worked on them one at a time? What do you think could have happened?
Maybe got 2 of the 3.
They could have probably gotten 2 completely done rather than 3 like 60 to 80% done. So that's the psychology behind limiting the work in progress, or the intent behind it is if we can limit what we're doing, we can focus on getting something completely done first. So if you see these types of things in your team, if you see these things in your Scrum board, it's a moment to look and maybe reflect with the team. Hey, what's going on here? What can we do? What can we do to course correct mid-sprint? I also like to look halfway through the sprint, just kind of do a sanity check. Where are we at? Are we going to finish on time? Now, Joe's saying ask that question every day, and I like that. I like looking at that every day, but especially mid-sprint, that's a really nice midway point to make sure that you're on track.
Question.
Yeah.
So the Kaizen box, in there obviously it's at the top, so it was the highest priority. And then your 2 examples of, it's 2 of the 3 warning sign examples, it's in the doing. But does it get done? I mean, so you,
Maybe not. Probably
The
not.
or is it
Kaizen?
continuous? Yeah.
This is an interesting board. I haven't structured a board like this myself. Joe, have you had teams that have done it this way?
I have, but to Maria's point, Core Scrum is 353. It doesn't say a specific Scrum board structure, but this Kaizen, if you read the super tiny font for all of us, is one that the team has agreed to do every day of the sprint, so it's not done till the sprint's done. Some Kaizens, the team can measure done earlier, depending what it is. This one, I can't read it from here, but I remember from the team that
Daily clean code.
Daily clean code, right? So they're saying each day, are we not going home with any open bugs? Is what they've agreed to do, hardware or software, and so they won't know that's done till the last day of the sprint.
So they could, for example, if they want to be visible, they could just create new tags and they're done day 1, yes, day 2,
Sure.
yes,
They wanted to.
day 3,
Sure they could.
yeah, something.
Yeah.
Now, Jill, would you recommend putting retrospective action items in this?
That would be the Kaizen.
Always now. So, and actually, Maria, to your point, there's a section just on that.
Next.
After, is it next?
Is it? No.
It's called Scrumming the Scrum.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that idea a lot. I haven't seen a board like this before, but I like the idea of trying that. Having that Kaizen row and that swim lane tells you, hey, this is what we plan to improve on in the retrospective. Are we doing that and keeping it front of mind? I have a team that said the quality was a little bit getting questionable for them, and they decided they wanted to do more code reviews out of the retrospective. And in order to do that, they wanted to make it visible by keeping track of every time they did a code review. On the whiteboard, they'd write the number of the product backlog item and then the initials of who reviewed it. And then at the end of the sprint, they could see, hey, did we do more code reviews or not? And they could go back and look, did we have more or less defects? What did that look like? But if you don't make it visible, it's hard to track if that happened. So I really like, the idea of, making the adjustments that you need for your task board, whatever works for your team, and you can try something new. I personally always stick with the roadblock column that's usually always in my boards, but I want to try the Kaizen one. I think that swim lane sounds kind of cool. Now here's a question. Does this look troublesome, this board? Why? Because everything's being done at the same time. Maybe lack of priority. You might have people working in silos, possibly. What's interesting here, though, this is actually from a company you may have heard of, Skype, and they. This is one of their teams, and this was their WIP. So their work in progress very high. How do you think this team was doing? You think bad?
We don't know because the work in progress. We don't know because the work in progress is supposed to have a number on top of it. Until we don't see the number, we don't know if they're good or bad.
Okay, so we're not
if
sure.
If they're work in progress, let's say 15, and it's only 14 sticky notes in that column, they're doing perfectly fine.
Okay, so it depends. Is that too much work for this team?
There's also something else that stands out if you look closer. There's people's names assigned to these individual tasks. It's probably why there's so much in work in process, because no one's pairing or swarming and moving things to done.
Okay.
You don't have a burn down chart, so we're also missing the visibility of how close they are to the end of the sprint. I'm not saying that they're blocked or saturated in some way.
Okay, so maybe we're not sure. Maybe we need more information.
If we look at the column on the very left, is the queue. There's nothing there, so they're working on almost everything that's possible. They started on everything. That's waterfall.
Oh, okay.
That's not agile. That's waterfall.
Interesting. So a couple of takeaways here. One, this doesn't look ideal. And the other thing is we don't actually know how good or bad this is. Sometimes you see stuff that, visually, but we don't know unless we know the story behind it. Now, from my conversations with Joe, there's actually a good story behind here. So even though this is not ideal for a team to have all work in progress at the same time, Jim Copeland, he was doing some work with Skype, and he's been working with Scrum Inc., and he actually, said this isn't necessarily the best Scrum they've ever seen. However, what's that number at the top? $8.5 billion. That's what Microsoft bought Skype for. So the takeaway here is that even bad Scrum is better than good waterfall, right? So even doing Scrum not as optimally or as effective as it could be, it still had better output and better results that resulted in selling the company for $8.5 billion. And we can aspire to be better with our Scrum, but maybe that's not a bad way to be. To at least be Scrum, even if you're not doing it the 3-5-3 properly, at least if you're incrementally getting closer every day, starting to retrospecting and improving, start somewhere and then incrementally improve from there. And then we can all be billionaires. Is that it, Joe? Be billionaires?
Let's all do that.
That'd be great.
Now, would whoever's doing the burn down, is it me? I'll do the burn down. Is there you next?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Time. 11:29 on the shelf up there. I'm sure because it started 11:07. Well, I burned it till 11:29. But then I had a technical error.
Good. So, before we start, Mike Leber, I'm from Austria. I already mentioned it. I'm working actually globally, so across multiple continents. And since last autumn, I have one problem. I have to admit, I'm speaking at conferences and I always tell in advance. I had to repair something around my teeth. So I had to get a tooth pulled out. And I got a replacement. It was in September. I'm still waiting for everything happening for an implant. I got a replacement, and the first time when I started to talk with it, it was like didn't get anything out of my mouth. So I just said, okay, I have to live with it. So if people, from beneath should see something missing in here, I'm trying to cover it as good as it gets, but it's just, there's something going on. In German, I cannot say damn it because it starts with verdammt. So I always have to say that. That's the first thing. Second thing, it's a real premiere because the first time I teach without shoes. So that's really great. Yeah, backlog refinement. So that was one of the meetings we already somehow mentioned. But let's start with a short definition first. We talked a lot about product backlog already. And a few more details about what a product backlog actually is. Specifically, it's everything which has to be done in order to achieve the value we're after. So we know it's the product owner's core artifact. And what is quite interesting, we always talk about user stories going into product backlogs. But actually, the Scrum Guide doesn't mention user stories at all. It basically talks about product backlog items, PBIs. By the way, Scrum Guide doesn't even talk about software. So if you look after software in a Scrum Guide, you wouldn't find it. We know it comes from software development. We just heard the stories about Jeff Sutherland. But the original core doesn't come from the software industry either. So basically bringing Scrum back to non-IT environments or non-software environments should be quite an easy one because it's basically open for it. Now, so everything which is in the product backlog, so everything which has to be done around a Scrum initiative, I don't call it project for certain reasons, don't go into this now, is called a product backlog item. And as just mentioned, most teams around the globe call their items user stories. Not sure, anybody using anything else than user stories? Probably not. You could actually put use cases in there if you liked. Yeah? Now, where does the product backlog come from? That's the interesting thing. Most people might say, well, there's a product owner, somehow they created it, and then next we just prepare a sprint, start a sprint planning, and here we go. And that's obviously a trap, because obviously even with an average size of a product, we need some preparation around it. Specifically, we have a goal to say, okay, the sprint planning should be time boxed too. So if you want to start a sprint tomorrow, if we have a planning today, or maybe start in the afternoon, have a planning in the morning, there is a kind of a guidance you might find in the Scrum Guide, which might tell us per sprint week, the planning should not take longer than 2 hours. So for two week long sprints, that would result at around an average maximum of 4 hours. Now guess what happens if the teams come in there and the product owner is telling about the stories they want to implement or have implemented, and the team's gonna see the stories first time. So now we have a estimation round, and people just say, oh, interesting, what's that all about? What are all those details about? Let's do an estimate. Oh, wonderful, that must be a 34 or a 20, whatever. So we need actually, something which makes sure that things we want to achieve during a sprint are already taken care for sometimes before. And this thing we use for doing that is the product backlog refinement. The product backlog refinement is actually an ongoing activity throughout the initiative of a Scrum project, not named a project. So that means it can happen before sprints, and it usually happens during sprints. So while teams are sprinting, there would be usually some time the product owner and the teams would agree upon to reserve to maximum, to regularly look a little bit ahead for the next 1, 2, maybe 3 sprints. Depends a little bit upon the complexity of the product undergoing and the complexity of the sprints, the length of the sprints. So what we achieve then is basically we're achieving a ready backlog. And you heard already about definition of done, I think. I can't remember actually yesterday if you mentioned it. At the same time, we have this definition of ready. So actually, that's not the right slide. We just want to make sure that the stories we want to take care for in a sprint are properly prepared, that we actually can consider them, can talk about them, and actually can plan for them, and finally can work on them and deliver them. That's very important. So the refinement meeting is basically a key essential to make sure that we're getting towards ready user stories which can be implemented and basically pulled into a sprint. Got a question?
It is, you just talk about the definition of ready and the definition of done.
We're coming to the definition of ready just in a minute.
Okay.
But you might consider it like, okay, if you get a sprint, obviously what goes into the sprint, what we want to pull into a sprint, there should be something which checks if things are ready. So let's call that definition of ready, kind of standards, our understanding. How should it look like that we can, properly start working on it in order to be confident on delivering it after 2 weeks? And on the other hand side, at the end of the sprint, there should be something, we call it definition of done, which just makes sure that everything was done that potentially what has been, aggregated or integrated could be delivered. So that, for example, does mean, okay, no testing needed anymore because it's tested, it's integrated. It doesn't only work on my machine, but it basically works on, the production platform. Now, coming to this product backlog items, there is this user story notion. I already mentioned it. User stories have a different source of origin. Anybody knows where they come from? Again, non-coaches, non-trainers.
Customers?
Yeah, they come from customers, but in terms of the origin, in terms of who started, applying user stories. I mean, who came up with the idea? Where that comes from? Any idea? Anybody knows any other agile methods which were popular 17 years ago? 20 years ago? It's my time, sorry. Extreme programming. So that used to be quite popular in the late 90s, early 2000s. So in extreme programming, actually, the user story notion was explicitly integrated, and basically Scrum finally somehow took it over as a practice, as a very useful practice. And in addition, you sometimes see this template, how user stories are formulated as a role. So for example, I'm not sure what a role we could think about, a bank accountant, I would like to be able to achieve something, a goal, I don't know, to create a deposit or whatever, in order to achieve a business value. So what would be the value behind it? That is a very common format, again, coming from some origin, some company in the extreme programming world, just started that one day. And it basically helps to gain focus. Another one, what is a user story, about? What's the core attributes of a user story? There is this triple C, a user story somehow attached to, again, coming somehow from the extreme programming community. Card, a user story fits basically to a card, an index card. So that means a user story doesn't have to be written over 10 pages of Word documents. A second, a user story is, and that's I think the most interesting one, a promise for a conversation. So this basically means if we have a user story here today and we just write it on on an index card, we don't have to go into all the details now, but it's a placeholder where we just say the right time at the right place when we will want to drag this user story into implementation. We'll obviously have some refinement before where we want to have a conversation about the details behind it, which might result into clarification about some functionalities, about needed, circumstances, maybe about splitting it, whatever it is. It's just a placeholder. And the third one, it's confirmable, it's confirmed. So this means each user story should be very clear about how it can be confirmed. So we want to talk about acceptance criteria. In the extreme programming world, and also in the Scrum projects I coach, if we use physical boards, we just attach the acceptance criteria on the back of the card. So this is not really test cases, it's kind of guidance. What are the core attributes the user story will fulfill? Very often useful if you run through a sprint demo to look after those acceptance criteria. These are the most important aspects what the user story is after. Again, it comes from a different direction. It's not part of the original Scrum definition, but it's a very common practice, probably applied in most places. Any question about that? How we write user stories. Now here is a user story. Not sure if you know this guy. Looks quite similar compared to my haircut. As a captain, I'd like the log function to automatically use today's star date. What's not so useful about this user story? Pardon?
Why?
Pardon?
No, why? Why
Looks
is it
like, yeah, it talks a lot about technology, doesn't it? What's the purpose behind that, please?
It's also not from the user's perspective.
Exactly. I mean, a captain could be a user, but it's not very specific. I mean, who is talking about which value here? Why would I need it? For what? And what else?
He's dictating the technology.
He's dictating actually the technology, and that's very interesting. We talked about that already a little bit. You know, there's a product backlog, and it's owned by the product owner. And the product owner is not actually supposed to invite for a concrete solution to say, you know, here is something I need, and here is the way I want to have it implemented. The product backlog and user stories are talking about achieving business value, what we need, and a team later will figure out how we want to implement it. That's a very useful separation of concerns in relation to many aspects. Why would you think that's useful? Any ideas?
It frees the team to innovate and come up with some better way.
Exactly. It's first of all, it's getting us away from, you know, big upfront planning and all the details, and it gives us alternatives to look after. The team can come up with creative solutions. It's like, you know, not telling a team, here is a river, I want a bridge, please build a bridge. It's just saying, here is a river and we want to cross it. And you will figure out later what's the best possible way. Maybe the, you know, kind of workaround solution or a more sporty solution or something which lasts for a longer time.
Are there situations where you are constrained to bridge, to building only a bridge? Where it has to be dictated?
Could be that in certain regulated environments or whatever you're currently into, that there are constraints which guide you towards a certain set of solutions. But be clear that you don't narrow down the solution already to something exactly where you say, sorry, I know already the solution. Because that's actually your enemy with innovation, with actually achieving agility as an organization. Okay. Now, what we have here, talking again about promise for conversation, is actually bringing the product backlog and all its contents out of the typical documentation domain. What you see here is actually the correlation between effectiveness of communication and the actual channels, the bandwidth we engage for communication. And as you can already imagine, using pure documentation up to, you know, whatever has been recorded is just a one-way communication. And especially in complicated domains where there is no best solution, it's sometimes very dangerous, you know, to just deliver something and say, this is it, even with a good notation format, and then expecting that in other people's head, exactly the same understanding will start growing. Usually the opposite happens. And then people wonder that they must say, didn't I document what I needed and you give me something totally different? Oh, we thought you wanted this and that. So in order to get out of this, we want to have a bi-directional conversation. And the best and most effective thing, and we just talked before about distributed teams, would be co-located teams, co-located people, basically in front of a whiteboard. So really engaging just for the conversation, not for a tool, not for a notation tool. If you need it, if you need any kind of additional documentation, of course you can use that. But here it's really about increasing the bandwidth and having a good conversation between a team, between business stakeholders, and so on. Now, we already mentioned before this term epic. And we already figured out, well, an epic, again, is nothing else than a product backlog item. And it's just used to notate a kind of a larger size of a thing. You can just say it's something we wouldn't immediately jump on and start working on it. It's just too large. I think that's why it translates to epic. Now, if it's a large thing, we want to split it. And splitting it would basically mean it results into user stories. And the nice thing, just to think about it, again, a tool-related question. After we split it, usually the epic is gone. I compare it with a big rock. You know, you crack a big rock, and after you cracked it into little stones, that's now the little user stories, the big rock is gone. Because sometimes people ask for documentation purposes, okay, where is my epic going? Shall we still maintain this? Well, what for? I mean, if you need it for documentation purposes, you can still do that, and there are methods out there. I don't want to mention one, it was already mentioned today, which even has, you know, specification, what type of epic it is. There could be business epics and technical epics. Pure Scrum doesn't look after that. But it's all about saying, okay, if we want to implement that, and we already said an item should be implementable during one sprint. So we don't want to have items crossing sprint boundaries. We obviously have to consider what would we need to do in order to make it more concrete so that we can deliver it specifically and within a given time span of 2 weeks. And there is a lot of guidance out there how we can achieve that. How could we split something that can go after various things? Are there any ideas from your side how we could, you know, look after a bigger thing to split it into smaller stories, user stories? Any aspects we might think about? So here is the big thing. I want, you know, a frequent flyer, I want to book flights, customize a whole booking system. What would be aspects to look after?
It's several techniques from the product owner. So basically we can split them by person. So who is
Okay,
going to
yeah.
try to use that?
Exactly.
By functionality.
Exactly.
So, and well, several other ones.
Functionality is a good one. We could think about scenarios. We could think about, well, maybe let's not start with the most complicated one. We might drive some risk out if we start a more complicated one, but basically let's start with the most standardized version. And then we add some special variations, exactly as you see it here. Sometimes we might look after data-oriented types of slices. To say, okay, here is one which starts, actually we had that before with a banking thing. Only getting money and then, you know, putting money and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of guidance out there which you can use actually how to look after potentials for splitting user stories.
And acceptance criteria?
Yeah, exactly. Acceptance criteria could either go to one user story or they could help you slice a user story into sub-stories. Now, if we look after a product backlog, there is another notion which is quite important, that user stories always try to deliver something complete. So if you're into a, you know, technical solution, I think especially in the hardware domain, that's a very interesting one. We're not looking after, okay, here's a user story maybe somewhere from a middleware, somewhere from a backend, somewhere maybe from a front end. We want to deliver a user story which is basically creating value as such, which could be basically delivered somehow. So we want to have slices crossing the whole application, as good as it gets. If we wouldn't do that, we even would have probably a problem if here comes the product backlog, and the product owner says, you know, here's the most important item after business value, it's something tangible out of my business, and we come and say, well, okay, we can only deliver the data backend for that. So it wouldn't probably be anything about the actual business functionality. It would even create a lot of dependencies between what we implemented here. There is a couple of acronyms for the product backlog as well for the user stories, which you just might carry in your mind. I actually forgot the one for the product backlog. It's called DEEP, D-E-E-P. So good product backlog is DEEP. Would you, anybody know what the D stands for? Or still remembers? Pardon? detailed appropriately. So that basically means the product backlog doesn't need to be an fully elaborated specification from A to Z. It's basically something where we want to look at it. I always compare it with a metaphor of an iceberg. The next most important visible things might be the next 2-3 sprints ahead. But we don't want to elaborate all details for something which might be developed in a year or so, and maybe even might not be developed because currently it's underneath the iceberg or underneath the sea level, and maybe in 2-3 months we changed our mind because we learned something. So we actually wasted our time to get into all those details. E, what's another? Pardon? Emergent, so that's what I just mentioned. We learn, we continuously learn, so we add stuff to the backlog, we change maybe stuff from the backlog. Another one, another E?
Is it estimated?
It's estimated. Each backlog somehow is estimated. Again, we'll have a very detailed estimation on top, and maybe the epics are roughly estimated. P, what does the product owner do? Prioritizes. So that's the idea of a good backlog. Then we have a nice one for the user stories because they could follow the invest principle. And here's a little bit of a tweak because the original one was talking about I for independent, and Scrum Inc. changed that to immediately actionable, which is even more specific, just to say, well, sometimes we have dependencies, of course, a little bit, something has to follow the other one. I need to have some data, whatever. I might mock it, or I don't know. We had our experiences with a car downstairs. But we know quickly, is this an item we can immediately jump on and deliver in the next 2 weeks or not? Because if not, we just put it back. Because there is something missing, there is something essentially still to be clarified, and usually the story would be probably very large. Negotiable. I already mentioned the product owner is talking about what he wants to have. But it should be negotiable how to implement. So the two sides of the single medal don't fix the solution. Valuable, very important one, obviously. And that's sometimes not that easy. I mean, if we've got a very small item already, we might say, valuable, I'm not sure how that can really create value specifically on the market. Well, it really is, going to the direction saying, but if you add something, if you put a couple of those into a release, or if you would think about the epic, which we just crunched before, at least this one should achieve a certain amount of value in terms of business value, increased business value. Estimable, very obvious. I mean, if a team is able to even get it, what the story is all about, or if there is so much complexity involved that they have no idea. Size to fit is quite an interesting one, because size to fit would basically mean, first of all, it has to fit into a sprint, and on the other hand side, how small could it get so that we are not just working on one item over 2 weeks, and at the last day of the sprint we figure out, oh, we didn't make it. So basically we run in blind mode every day. Size to fit would help us that it's small enough that we can gain feedback in short cycles, not too short, probably not every hour, but maybe once or once every day or every second or third day. What I like very much to talk with teams about things like what can be achieved in 1 day, what can be achieved within this week, and everything else, which is just too large. And I know there is something on the market, somebody says, too fucking big, or what's the other one? No fucking idea. So these are the two things. And the other one is one. Yeah, exactly, it's one. Those 3 items. So you've got either one, or it's too fucking big, or no fucking idea. Sorry for the word. Sorry for the word. I think that's Paweł Broczynski, he's a Kanban colleague from Poland, if you want to refer to it. So the important thing here is size to fit. It should be small enough so that we can actually see, if we go in front of our burn down chart day by day, it's not a flat line or, understanding someday during the sprint it will be finished, but it's small chunks of work where we get feedback basically every 2, 3, or 4 days. Quite important. And testable, that somehow relates to, we have a clear understanding what the story is about, so it's confirmed. What we had before with the CCC. A question about that?
Yeah, question.
Please.
So the the split across
the layers.
Would you talk to it? I mean, does
Yeah,
that sound
once
like
again, it is the idea about end-to-end, as good as it gets. Of course, if we look downwards, I mean, that's a little bit easier with software again, because here we have basically the idea of a software solution, going through multiple layers, like a graphical user interface. Then here it's a client, can be any kind of persistence, or there is a server part, here is a database persistence. I wouldn't like to see stories which do a little bit of the DB scheme, and another story which delivers a GUI, which would be basically a mock-up. I want to have a story which includes a little bit of a GUI, a little bit of the middleware, a little bit of persistence. And sometimes this is a little bit to be balanced out, of course. But focus on end-to-end stories as good as it gets. Chris, you have a...
I was just going to say, like, we just were downstairs on the car, rear suspension.
Yeah,
in
exactly.
and of itself, it's valuable. I mean, we wouldn't need to bolt it back on and not, integrate with the larger car, but that's the way to look at a vertical slice. Something of value, not just a little bit of something, but in and of itself, it's actually valuable.
Yeah.
So this isn't speaking to do product backlog definitions cross different teams.
No, it's again, one team, it's basically about the story, the items which are in the backlog. We don't want to, I mean, if you call it, you go more specifically, we don't want to have too many of technical stories. The stories are meant to deliver value, and the value would come from a whole thing. And not from, oh, here is a bit of something, but if we deliver it, somebody would say, oh, great, and when comes the rest?
Right.
Oh, maybe in sprint number 20. So that wouldn't be agile. If we would stop the project here after 5 sprints and we just have a few components, that's not the idea of the whole game. And of course, that helps us to learn faster, because this way we start integrating earlier. We look at the whole thing earlier, and not just saying, oh, the GUI works, great, after 2 months, but now comes do real hard thing. Did that answer your question? And again, it's quite helpful to write user stories, where we obviously don't have time now, but really to sit down and just write a few from your domain, and just figure out how they could look like. I already mentioned definition of ready, and here's just an example, just to say good user stories. We're really focusing on a very mature definition of ready. Would say we're very clear that we have acceptance tests. That's one thing organizations usually come up with, or teams come up with. We might have a wireframe. So we might have some sketch, some mock-up of a screen, whatever, and we might look after estimates to say there is a maximum threshold. A user story should never be larger than, for example, for my teams, it's usually 8 if we go for Fibonacci, just to say everything beyond 8, we don't want to treat as ready because it's still too complex. So we want to look after breaking it down into smaller chunks. Quite interesting, not sure how much time is left, quite interesting side information. Pardon?
We're just over time for this.
We're over time, so I just want to mention this. This is an interesting study which actually points out towards more information doesn't help you to get better at delivery, but it basically creates bias for the teams, for those who are estimating. The more complicated the documentation, for example, looks, the higher they will go for the same thing in terms of estimation. And there is even research, so you can refer to this research, which basically says if you would print the same definition just with higher line height, so to create more papers, they would create larger estimates. So it's quite helpful to understand focused information, CCC user stories, and then having a conversation would basically fulfill the needs for understanding what we want to deliver. Understanding what we deliver doesn't mean, you remember the one value pair of the Agile Manifesto, that we only have to rely on user stories. What was the one which is important here? You remember the 4 value pairs? A over B, peoples and interactions and overs. You remember any one of those which refers to how we deal with documentation? Working software, over comprehensive documentation, and you remember we said
working product now, so it's meaning
working product even is better. And I know I want to point out there is a rework of the Agile Manifesto which was only done by Kent Beck, which even has a more interesting, fancy wording. But it says over, it doesn't say no documentation at all. So whatever documentation you would need for your specific domain is still valid to create. But just make sure that it's easy to handle. It might be, as I just said before, some sketch notes on a whiteboard, a little picture of it going into a wiki, where the user story would finally point to clarify what we are after. And this is a very interesting one, because this goes the other way around. If you really know complicated domain, there is this notion of enabling specification. This is something where Jeff actually wrote an interesting blog post on Scrumming's blog, where they came up with something they wanted to understand in the patent area, what amount of information it needs as a minimum to get actually a patent accepted or filed finally. And that was around 3 to 5 pages. So the idea here is to say, if you are working in a more complicated domain, you should just make sure that you are creating an enabling specification, which is very simple, very straight, enabling people to derive with the appropriate knowledge user stories from. So again, it's not back to the thick, fat documentation, but it's helping you to get out of a very stressful conversation during the sprint, where people just have